Hi, everybody. It's Bob Lindblad. A lot of you know me. I've presented at a lot of the investigators' meetings, and what we'd like to do today is go over general reporting of adverse events in the CTN clinical trials. We've tried to put this together with an overview that I'll present, then Blake Apple will go through the perspective from an RA and a CTP, and then Maria Campanella will follow up with additional information as far as reporting, and they'll overlap some during the presentation. We've included a lot of slides in this slide set, and we're going to move through them fairly quickly. We're hoping that they will serve as a reference for you so that you can go back and re-look at them, and we are not planning to read through every item on every slide. We do encourage you asking questions by entering those into the system here, where we can address those at the end of the presentation. In addition, we'll open up phone lines to take live questions as well, too, depending on how many questions we have. So with that, I'm going to get started with the first portion of this. So this is the group of the three of us that will be presenting today. So the first part I'm going to discuss is sort of the clinical and regulatory importance of monitoring safety in research trials. A lot of this is driven by the Declaration of Helsinki, where within the context of doing clinical trials, there's been a concern to protect the safety of people that end up participating in clinical trials. This is also further discussed in ICH guidelines, which are guidelines that are international in scope, deal with the European Union, United States, Japan, Australia, and multiple other countries as well, too. In addition to the federal government, for NIH-funded trials, there is the need to monitor and protect the safety of human subjects. So why monitor safety in the CTN trials? You know, sometimes it comes up that it's not an IND study, so it's not drug development, it's not really controlled by FDA. Why are we doing that? And that has to do with the fact that these trials are funded through NIH. There are specific NIH requirements to monitor safety in the trials, and it's part of good clinical practice, which is another driving factor that any clinical trial we do, we want to make sure we protect the welfare of the participants. So when I look at these clinical trials in the CTN and in trials across other study platforms as well, too, we look at what intervention are we doing and what's the population. One of the unique aspects of the NIDA trials is our population is a high-risk, vulnerable population, and that automatically increases the risk of doing research in this population. Our interventions tend to have less risk associated with them than some interventions in other disease areas, but the population is unique to it being a high-risk population and similar in scope at times to pediatric populations that are also considered high-risk as well, too. And it's this combination of the intervention coupled with the population that really identifies the anticipated risk for any given clinical trial. So when we think about strategies for reporting, we identify the risk in the proposed clinical trial as was shown on the previous slide. We try and tailor the reporting to be match the type of risk that we've identified, and we also try and maintain standard adverse event language in the protocol and the in the consents and the case report forms, so that as we describe the safety events, it's similar to the descriptions that you would see in any clinical trial being conducted. So this is just a note for those of you that may be involved in drug trials as well, too, and some of the NIDA trials may in fact be under IND, and they have been in the past as well, too, though they're less frequent. FDA has issued new regulations, which is really changing the safety reporting laws that we work under, and new guidance documents associated with that. this will actually impact trials beyond just FDA-regulated trials in that it changes some of the language that we'll probably use as well, too. They did that to make their systems more compatible with the ICH and GCP guidelines as well, too. These are going to be implemented towards the end of March, and so even in the CTN trials, you may see some subtle changes in the language and descriptions of how we report relationship to the study intervention that we're doing. So overall, why do we report safety? It's really the right thing to do to make sure that participants that are joining our clinical trials are doing that in a safe manner, and the CTN population does meet the criteria of a vulnerable population, which puts more onus on protecting their safety. So what sort of processes do we do within the CTN trials? We identify and review events. We make determinations whether it's an AE or an SAE. We make sure that we resolve events, and then, we have discussions like this and provide guidance in terms of reporting of events to make it easier for the various CTP and clinical trial participants and reporters. So when we talk about safety events, we're really combining both adverse events and serious adverse events into one terminology, because the processes are similar with some different reporting rules for serious adverse events. So standard definition for an adverse event is basically anything that occurs that is a change from their baseline that is occurring within the context of participation in the trial, but not necessarily related to their participation in the trial. In a serious adverse event, this language is fairly standard. The new regulations will change that a little bit, and it will probably change in our studies. They got rid of the word disability in the fourth item down. So when do we report adverse events and serious adverse events? At every contact with the participant, especially every study visit, we enter those into the data system if they are reportable based off the definitions of the protocol. Typically, adverse events are entered within 7 days of that visit or acquiring that information, and serious adverse events within 24 hours. So that's really the introduction of this, and then we'll go into some details with Blake and Maria, and then be open for questions. Thanks.
Okay, everyone. Again, I'd like to encourage you to use the Q&A feature if you do have any questions, and we can address those at the end of the presentation. With that, Blake, I'll turn things over to you.
Okay. I'm Blake Apple. I worked on CTN 31 and CTN 31A, and I'm currently working on CTN 37. Identifying safety events. Know your protocol. It's all in the details. The protocol defines the rules for reporting adverse events. It also defines the notification timeframes and reporting responsibilities. Adverse events can be identified through a variety of ways. Direct participant discussions, direct observation of the participant, like bruises on their body, family or friends of the participant, newspaper articles as in death announcements, confidential discussions with other research staff, and discussions with outside providers if the participant has given consent to do so. Following up on unresolved AEs and SAEs. It's easy to forget a certain participant has an open AE. If the AE or SAE is not resolved at the time it was reported, write AE on a brightly colored sticky note so that it is easily visible on the side of the source document page in the participant binder where the AE is recorded. Making the sticky note visible when the binder is closed prompts me or my coworker to follow up on it during follow-up visits until it is resolved. Any additional information gathered during visits after the AE has been reported should be documented in the visit's progress note. Safety events are chronically underreported in clinical trials because the participant is not forthcoming with the information, the research staff isn't asking the right questions, the information is hidden in a progress note and not recorded appropriately as a safety event, or the participant sometimes reports AEs in regular conversations. When a participant brings up an AE in conversation, probe them for details. I would also discuss possible future treatment or hospital visits and include all details in a progress note. When writing a progress note for a visit, write about the AE in detail in case a monitor has questions about the AE. Assume the visit you are currently having with the participant will be the last time you see them. Participants have a tendency to disappear. Reporting safety events. What information about an AE or SE needs to be reported? When a participant reports an event, the RA has to figure out the name of the event, the severity of the event, the relatedness of the event, if the event is a serious adverse event, and if the event is a reportable one, and also to whom, what, and when. The biggest challenge is the name of the event, knowing how to take everything that you see and hear during your assessment and boiling it down to one accurate and succinct term. Avoiding getting caught in the drama of the event. Sounds a lot easier than it is. Naming the events. The name of the event, the verbatim, equals the AE description. It doesn't mean write down verbatim what the participant says. It means write down simple, accurate, 2 to 3 words, and we prefer a diagnosis to symptoms. These next few slides are examples of AEs that were incorrectly reported during other clinical trials. Normally normal after drinking coffee. I don't even know what that really means. In a verbatim, that makes sense. Avoid vague or ambiguous medical terms, like an eye problem is really more like eye pain. Here's New Age music when the furnace turns on. Could this be a hallucination? And these are basically just acronyms or abbreviations that someone submitted. So here's an abbreviation, CA, which is correctly would be cancer. Abdominal discomfort secondary to airplane food ingestion. Stick to the facts. Do not use qualifiers. How about abdominal discomfort? Avoid extraneous data. Keep it simple. So something that was incorrectly submitted would be vomited several times at midnight after eating spicy food. Vomited would probably be a better answer. Muscle pain in the bag. Watch for typos. They can change the meaning. How about back pain? Where is it? Body site is needed for certain conditions. Congestion. Venous congestion would be a more correct terminology for an AE. Pees like a camel. How about excessive urination? We need complete medical terminology. Diabetes would be incorrectly. How about diabetes insipidus? Patient recently began a new job where he works around chicken wings and barbecue sauce. Well, it's nice information, but what is adverse event? Headaches and seeing people in a room, seeing chickens at the window. Well, enter only one event per CRF. I see 2 AEs in that. I see headaches and a possible hallucination. Don't place multiple diagnoses in one entry. Broken finger and hand abrasions. That's actually 2 AEs, 2 events. A broken finger and then a hand abrasion. Okay, now I'm going to hand this over to Maria.
Hi, this is Maria Campanella. I'm a nurse and a safety monitor with the CTN network, and I have the opportunity to read the verbatims that are submitted as safety events and help in the determination as to whether or not they meet the criteria for serious adverse event reporting. And then I also get to do the Medra coding, which is sort of the final part of the process after you've submitted your events to the trial database. So one of the reasons that we sort of insist on these verbatims being accurate, succinct, and medically, well, more appropriately medically accurate, is because the verbatims are important for us to continue our Medra, to complete our Medra coding. Medra is a medical dictionary for regulatory activities. It's really a way for people to put data into a database and have it be interpretable by different companies, different countries, different regulatory agencies around the world, regardless of where the data originates, wherever the research originates. And so it allows people to share information and analyze data related to the safe use of medical products. It was developed by the International Council on Harmonization, ICH, and it is the standard for coding in clinical trials. It's not a dictionary for drugs. There's a different section for that, but it does allow us to put information into system organ classes and to assign specific safety terms from other terminologies to help us, again, to narrow down the scope of what's being reported and make it consistent across trials. The easiest way to do that is there's usually a human. Sometimes it's done automatically, but there's usually a human who has to interpret the events that are reported and translate these into dictionary terms. So it really helps us to have good terms that help us to very quickly weed out what the event is and assign it a Medra code. So these slides are really just telling you about all the different levels of Medra coding. We tend to code at the preferred term level, and as you can see, there are about 18,000, almost 19,000 terms that we can choose from. So the most specific and succinct term that you can use when you're choosing your verbatims is very important to us. That's why we don't want all that additional extraneous information, why we don't want more than one term on a CRF, and why we want you to be as accurate in that reporting as possible.
Once you've named the event, then you have to characterize it. Events are characterized by determining their relatedness and severity. The relatedness of the event refers to whether the event is thought to have been caused by or made worse by the study intervention. Is the event related to the study intervention that the participant has been randomized to? Regardless of what you choose, it all boils down to either yes or no. Unrelated, no. Possibly related, yes. Probably related, yes. Definitely related, yes. There are 5 different grades of severity. Grade 1 is mild, 2 is moderate, 3 is severe, 4 is life-threatening, and 5 is death. One event can change in severity as the event unfolds. You report only increases in severity, but not decreases in severity of a particular event. Using the example of a headache, day 1 might be a headache that goes away by simply taking Advil, mild. Day 2, the medication masked the headache, but it came back worse than previously, so that the participant had to go home from work, moderate. Day 3, the headache has worsened to a migraine and the participant is unable to get out of bed, severe. Day 4, pain becomes so severe that the participant is brought to the hospital and is determined that she has suffered a stroke, life-threatening. Day 5, participant dies from the results of the stroke. Obviously, this is death. Remember that severe and serious are not the same thing. Serious events may be grade 2 moderate. Grade 3 severe events are not always serious. In this text block down here, there's a regulatory definition, death or is life-threatening or requires admission to an inpatient medical facility or prolongs a hospitalization or persistent or significant disability or incapacity or is a birth defect or congenital anomaly or requires medical intervention to prevent one of the above. But you should look to the protocol to determine if something is a serious adverse event.
And Blake, if I can interject, this is a scenario where, for instance, just a concrete example would be that a participant reports to you that they were bitten by a snake. And this is a serious occurrence in the life of this participant. It necessitated medical care. It was a very dramatic event and caused a lot of concern about their welfare. Not necessarily perhaps a life-threatening event. They went to the emergency room. They were treated and discharged to home. This is an event that, in the participant's mind, is an incredibly serious event. To them, they are using the word serious. But this is where you have to be careful when you're assessing these events. Is the event serious by definition of an SAE seriousness? Or is it just a severe event or maybe even a moderate event?
Okay, the reportability of an event in CTN trials is based on two things: your protocol and your IRB. Your site-specific IRB requirements may differ from protocol reporting requirements. This slide right here is kind of a chart that shows how an AE gets moved through different layers. So who reports AEs and SEs? The participant reports it to the study staff. The study staff reports it to the EDC and the site IRB. EDC reports it to NIDA CTN Safety Office, and NIDA CTN Safety Office reports it to the sponsor. The staff needs knowledge of the protocol requirements and also a process for listing adverse events related information from your participants and for reporting this information to the medical monitor, safety monitor in the appropriate time frames and for following up and resolving reported events. In order to correctly report an AE, you need knowledge about how your site's IRB reporting requirements differ from the protocol requirements and a process for reporting to the IRB and for documenting evidence of this reporting to a protocol monitor. Consider a cheat sheet that will break down what is reportable for protocol versus reportable for the IRB. Ask questions. Ask your RRTC if you're unsure if an AE is reportable for your local IRB. Email the lead team if you have a question about whether or not an AE is reportable for the protocol. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Maria.
So one of the hardest things to do in CTN trials is, because our participants are often transient, and as Blake mentioned, sometimes they don't even come back, we need to resolve safety events. And it's a challenge in all clinical trials, but it's a particular challenge within CTN trials, again, just because of the nature of our participants. So you've done your process so far. You've identified the event, you've named it by giving it the right succinct verbatim, you've characterized it by determining the severity and whether or not it's related to your study. You've even reported it in the EDC database, according to your protocol, and you've reported it to your IRB. But now what do you do? Well, as Blake mentioned before, you have to have a process. You have to have a process for making sure that you go back and resolve events. The goal being not to have any ongoing unresolved events at the end of your trial. All adverse events should have an outcome. An outcome may end up being death, and that may be the best you can get, but that is an outcome as to determine why you couldn't collect any more information. All adverse events, even serious adverse events and deaths, should have a resolution date or an end date. Blake was talking earlier about having sticky notes on the sides of pages. Some places have made logs where they keep track of what's ongoing, what's resolved per participant. So you have to find a process that works for you, and you stick to that process as long as you can make sure that at the end of the day, all of these steps have been completed. So there's two different kinds of resolutions. There's a clinical resolution to a safety event, and then there's a regulatory resolution. When we talk clinically about resolution, we want to know that someone's cold they've gotten better. So we report a cold or the flu, and we wait until they're better, and then we ask what day that resolved, and they give us a date, and that becomes our end date and our resolution. But there are some things that are chronic in nature, some illnesses like hypertension, depression, that may be more chronic in nature and may not be resolved within the context of your trial. Though there are a lot of different ways to resolve them, even though medically they may not be resolved. There's also a regulatory definition of resolution, though, and that means that events can be resolved once they're medically stable. So someone with hypertension is put on blood pressure medication, and their blood pressure becomes stable. Once an event is medically stable, or when they're no longer followed within the parameters of a clinical trial, so your 6-month follow-up period is over, 30 days have gone by from that 6-month follow-up period, and the participant is off doing their own thing, you can resolve that event. Within the CTN, you've got several options for resolution. You can resolve an event when an event is no longer present or when it's medically stable. You can resolve an event with sequelae if, for instance, the event is no longer an acute one, but there may be some residual effects from the event. You can also resolve it by death. As I mentioned before, that is definitely an outcome. But another option that you have within the CTN trials that may be new to many people who who've participated in other types of clinical trials is an option called resolution by convention. And this is sort of a definition that was put in from a regulatory standpoint. When you're not expecting that you're going to be able to follow up on an event any longer because the participant has either been lost to follow-up or the terms of the study their participation in the study have ended. So they've hit that 6-month follow-up period and 30 days have passed. That's when you can resolve an event by convention. And the convention is, we did our best to follow up with this event and find a resolution and an outcome information, resolution and outcome information for 30 days past the time that the participant was participating in this study. We did the best we could. We took progress notes. We made attempts to call. We kept a log of those calls. We did everything we could to try to find out information, and we have to resolve the event. That's when you choose resolve by convention. The resolve by convention is not something you should see when somebody's in week 3 of a 12-week study, because they're not through with that window yet. That's when you might use ongoing until you get to the actual time point where they are no longer participating in the study and you can no longer collect any information, that you use that resolution by convention option. So we follow AEs and SAEs until they're resolved, medically stable, or at least until 30 days have passed since their study completion date, since that last window. If a participant is lost to follow-up and resolution is not anticipated, then you should make every effort to locate them and resolve the event. That's doing due diligence. But once the study participation window ends and you still can't contact them, you can resolve by convention. It's a confusing concept, but you're always welcome to ask us questions about it if you have any questions. Whose responsibility is it to report events, to resolve events? It's actually any research staff member who comes in contact with an individual that's enrolled in a clinical trial. One of the most important things that you can take away from this presentation is protocol should be first and foremost the section that you go to in safety to tell you what your reporting requirements are by your protocol. The Manual of Operations and the CRF Instructions Manual can help. You've got a protocol safety monitor, a protocol monitor that comes to your site, a QA node monitor. You've got the study lead team. You've got a lot of resources if you have questions about safety events.
Again, if anybody has any questions, please utilize the Q&A feature located at the top of your screen. We're going to go ahead and we're going to move on to the polling questions now. Okay, why care about safety events in a CTN clinical trial? The polls are now open. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and leave the polls open. Maria, do you want to go ahead and review the results? How about you, Blake? You want to review the results?
Yeah, all NIDA CTN trials are under an FDA independent and reporting is required. 52% of the people thought that, and 47% of the people thought it's consistent with NIH funding of clinical trials. The correct answer is the red one. All NIDA CTN trials are under an FDA independent and reporting is required.
Great, thanks, Blake. I'm going to go ahead and move to the second polling question.
Okay.
What determines the risk in a clinical trial? The polls are open. Okay, Maria, do you want to go ahead and review the results?
Okay, so what determines the risk in a clinical trial? The answers 1 and 2, the population studied, intervention, are what will determine the risk in a clinical trial. And 95% of questionnaires got that correct.
Liz, can we go back to the previous one?
Sure.
So this is Bob, and I just want to review this again. So 56% of people said that NIDA CTN trials are under an FDA IND and reporting is required. And actually that ends up becoming a complaint that people have in that they say, well, we're not under IND, why do we have to do that? And part of this presentation is try to make a compelling argument that reporting safety is important whether or not it's under IND. We try and use similar language as what would be used if it were under IND so that when we report results, it's consistent with what's reported in the medical literature about safety and what an SAE is and what an adverse event is. So really the idea that NIDA is funded by NIH and NIH does require guaranteeing the safety and welfare or protecting the safety and welfare of people participating in clinical trials. That fourth answer is really the driving factor for the majority of the NIDA CTN trials. Very few of them are conducted under IND, but I think it's important to really recognize that distinction between the two. Okay, sorry.
Okay, question 3. A participant reports they have had a participant reports they have had symptoms of a cold for the last week. What would you do? The polls are now open. Okay, Marie, would you like to review the results? I'll go ahead and leave the polls open.
Okay. So 58% of the respondents said that it was, I would determine the severity of the event and then the relatedness, and then determine from the protocol whether or not it is reportable. 38% said it's an adverse event, so I would enter the information on an AE-CRF within 7 days. It is an adverse event, and you can enter the information on an AE-CRF within 7 days in many cases, but not always. So it's not necessarily that option 3 is the wrong answer. It's just more appropriate to say that you need to look at your protocol. That's your first resource, and that'll help you determine whether or not it's a reportable event. And you're looking at the severity of the event and the relatedness of the event because that's what's going to meet your protocol requirements. You're going to look at whether or not you need to report mild and moderate events, or whether you only need to report severe, life-threatening, or death events. Your protocol will tell you whether or not you need to report all events or only related events. You're really going back to looking at the protocol. That's the key in this question, is know your protocol. So the answer to number 2, determining severity, relatedness, and looking at the protocol is the appropriate response.
Okay, thanks, Maria. I'll move to question 4. You hear through the grapevine that a study participant has died. What should you do next? The polls are open. Okay, Marie, you want to go ahead and review that slide?
Sure. I think this question was put in primarily because this is a very common occurrence. People die in the course of everyday life, and so people will die on clinical trials. You can go down 2 paths when you're in a clinical position listening to a participant or hearing about a participant death. One is that you think to yourself, well, this is a behavioral trial, and it's clearly not related to anything we did in this study that would have caused this death. So you could kind of think option number 1, but you could also record the death in your progress note and just say, well, they died, and I don't need to know anything else because, again, it's not really related to the study. You could also bring it up on the next national call, and you should bring it up for discussion with the rest of the sites in your study team so that everyone's aware of it having occurred. But the best thing you can do in all of these is to try to find out the details surrounding the death, and that is what the majority of respondents suggested that we do, is find out more details surrounding the death. Deaths are reportable in CTN trials, and they are generally reported as serious adverse events because they meet the regulatory definition of a serious adverse event. You always want to try to find out as many details as you can. And again, in CTN trials, this is challenging because you're working, you oftentimes hear about these things through the grapevine. You hear about them from other study staff or other site staff, rather, that aren't related to your study. You try to follow up with someone. You hear about it from a family member who doesn't really want to give you much information because there's a lot of stigma about talking about overdoses or suicides or other things that may result in a death. So it is a difficult thing to track. It's a difficult thing to find. It is required by many protocols that you continue to follow this through by getting death certificates or autopsies reports. So you want to do as much, the best you can to get as much information about the death as possible. And likewise, when you report it as an adverse event and then subsequently as a serious adverse event, death is not really the most appropriate term. You want to try to find out the cause of death as much as possible. If for whatever reason the cause of death is unknown, you want to also specify in your verbatim, death, cause unknown, and that'll help with Medra coding.
Okay, we'll move to question 5. This is the last polling question. A study participant has an ongoing adverse event. Despite all efforts, the participant is lost to follow-up. What should you do next? Polls are now open. Okay, Marie, let's go ahead and go over that one.
Okay, so answer number 1, keep trying to contact the participant for 30 days and give up. You don't want to give up. You want to be able to resolve that event. You after 30 days probably will have to give up, but you want to make sure that you are doing your due diligence by resolving the event. You don't want to leave the event ongoing. A few respondents said to leave it ongoing. Remember that our goal is to try to resolve these events. So the best answer here is to keep trying to contact the participant for 30 days after their last visit window ends. If you can't reach them, which is oftentimes the case, you can change the event from ongoing to resolved by convention. So that is the correct response.
Okay, thanks, Maria. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the Q&A session. And this one's from Martha Gibson. Our difficulty is determining what is different from baseline. For example, if a person has ever had a headache, is a headache today an adverse event, a toothache, menstrual cramp? If a person has a pre-existing diabetes and blood sugar of 200, but is normal for, which is normal for the person, Maria, can you address that one?
Okay. So that's a good question, Martha. Sometimes it is difficult to determine from baseline, especially there are some clinical trials that don't do complete physical assessments or don't take complete medical histories. And so it is difficult sometimes to know what a person's baseline is. What you want to ask about is whether or not the headache is worse than if they tell you that it was a headache that they have had headaches at baseline. You're trying to determine whether or not a headache is worse since they've been involved in your study. Some events, again, depending on the protocol that it's being reported for, if they're mild and unrelated, may not even be reported for a protocol. They may not even be reportable. So a toothache or a headache that's mild might not even be reportable. If a person has a pre-existing blood sugar or diabetes and a blood sugar of 200, and that's normal for that person, again, it's only if a situation worsens, if an event worsens during the course of participation in your trial.
Maria, I'm sorry, I was muted. There was a question in earlier about who reports to the DSMB. Can we go over that a little bit?
Sure. That's actually the responsibility of the CTN safety office. So that would be done by our medical monitor here at EMMES, as we are the medical monitors for the CTN trials at this time. And we report to them usually on a biannual basis, and it's done based on information that we get from the database and from clarifying things with sites. So you will be contacted more than likely by a safety monitor if you report an event. In order for them to get additional information, you may be asked for any evidence of information that you have. Likewise, when a monitor comes to your site and looks at your source documentation, they're going to want to see that your source documentation matches what was actually entered for a given participant in the database. So we would appreciate your cooperation as much as possible. Usually we try to reach out to sites via email, sometimes via phone calls. And again, it's trying to get as much information, and it's de-identified information about a participant as possible, so that when we present this information to the Data Safety Monitoring Board, we're putting it in context and giving them the best picture possible. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, so I have another question. Number one, it just said that we shouldn't put two AEs in the same report. So, for example, a participant being hospitalized and having surgery while in the hospital, would that be one or two SAEs?
It largely depends upon what they're admitted to the hospital for. Most of the CTN protocols do not want an SAE reported, even if someone's going to be hospitalized for something that is a pre-planned or elective surgery. So in other words, if someone knows that they are going to have surgery for maybe a knee replacement or scheduled, for labor and delivery, or a C-section. Those are things that are not generally reportable in CTN trials. Now, someone might be taken to an emergency room with severe abdominal pain, and that may be the initial thing that's reported. When they're in the hospital, they're admitted because they have cholecystitis or an inflamed gallbladder, and then they have to have a cholecystectomy or have their gallbladder removed. You'd want to report the final diagnosis or the final event. All of those are related to the same event, so we wouldn't want you to report abdominal pain, then report the cholecystitis, then the cholecystectomy. You'd really want to just know what the event that took you to the hospital and had you having surgery for, because otherwise it would be like triple reporting the same event. So you want to report one event, and whatever event was reported with the most severe, the one that took it to the highest level of severity.
Thanks, Maria. Our next question, what flexibility do we have in defining reportable adverse events in the protocol?
I don't know if this question is coming from an investigator or from an RA.
From an RA. It's from Amy. If you'd like, we can press *1 right now if you'd like to open up the phone lines and ask the question, or anybody else may do the same.
So while we're doing that, this is Bob again, I can chip in a little bit. The decisions in terms of what gets reported is what's decided on in the protocol, and that decision is made by the CTN safety office here. It's made in conjunction with the investigators as well. It's looking at the overall risk in the protocol and trying to tailor safety reporting to that risk. Historically, all adverse events and all serious adverse events were reported in all trials, and the people conducting those trials often complained that it was a lot of work and it had very little safety yield associated with it. Over the past 4 years, we've worked at trying to maintain adequate safety vigilance and surveillance while decreasing the burden at the clinical site level for reporting events that would have less meaning and less utility. And there are several strategies that are involved in doing that. It could be reporting fewer events based off severity grading. It can be reporting fewer events based off of relationship grading. And there are variances on all of those themes, and we have incorporated those themes within the more recent CTN protocols. The difficulty with it, or the downside of it, is as much as there are complaints with reporting all events, there are also complaints with reporting selective events, because in doing that, somebody has to be able to evaluate events, make that selection, and then report it. And there's sometimes some anxiety or concern about whether or not the right thing is being done. And so we end up providing support for that and working through those issues as the clinical trial continues. But it's an iterative process. It is agreed upon within the context of the protocol. And then once that protocol is set up, that is the pattern that will be used for reporting. And that's why we emphasized in these trials for the NIDA CTN trials, it's critical that people are familiar with their protocol, know the structure of the protocol for reporting, and basically follow those guidelines that are outlined. We outline those at the investigators meeting as well, too. But that makes this sort of protocol-specific reporting, which can be different than some of your other clinical trials that you may be involved with.
And again, if you do have a question, we do encourage you to use the Q&A feature. If, however, you would like to ask a question over the phone, as was mentioned, please press * then 1 on your telephone keypad. Make sure that if you're on a speakerphone, that you make sure your mute function is turned off to allow your signal to reach our equipment. And no one is queued up over the phone lines at this time. Actually, we do have a question that just came in. We'll go to Amy Camarilli.
Hi, this is John Cassiola with Amy's group at Treatment Research Institute. And the basic question had to do with can you define at the extreme in the protocol as reportable events only AEs that are at least possibly related and SAEs, and basically leave it at that? Because you were mentioning like colds may not be a reportable event, and that could extend to, for instance, any sort of minor cuts, small cuts, bruises, black eye, et cetera. So can you use such broad strokes as only AEs that are at least possibly related and SAEs are the only reportable events, or is that too vague and too low a bar?
No, this is Bob again. That actually does work. It depends on the trial and the type of intervention as well, too. But we have used that type of system, though even reporting all SAEs tends to have limited value in certain trials. For instance, if it's strictly a behavioral intervention trial, reporting the fact that somebody developed gallbladder disease and got admitted and got their gallbladder taken out, which is an SAE, reporting that in the clinical trial database has very little relevance to the intervention. We found that we're probably more interested in psychiatric hospitalizations, maybe rates of suicide or other things like that, that may have more pertinence to the intervention that we're doing. So even saying all SAEs tends to be too broad within the context of the CTN trials. Using relationship alone can be a strategy, though sometimes people's ability to determine relationship is a struggle, and the terminology used is actually some terminology that will be changing in the new FDA guidelines that will come out that will probably impact some of the terminology we use as well. But some investigators will say that if any event occurs on trial, it could be possibly related because we can't rule out that it's related. We have used severity grading as another tool where we would say grade 1 and 2 events would not need to be reported, which would help eliminate probably 70% of the reported events if they're grade 1 and 2 and not related, as would compared to a trial that reports all of those events. So those are the strategies, and I think what you described is certainly a strategy that can be used, and it is defined enough that people would be able to follow that within the context of the protocol. But those are some of the issues that we've run into specifically with those determinations as well.
Okay, just one last question. I'm vice chair of the TRI-IRB, actually with Dr. Woody of the CTN as the chair of the IRB, and we have never felt a flexibility in SAE reporting, that those were formally defined, hospitalization, et cetera, death, and that, but yours, some SAEs as reportable events.
Right, and so you're absolutely right. SAEs are well defined, and the criteria to determine the SAE is well defined. Whether it has to be reported in the clinical trial database or not is a decision that can be made by the protocol that is reviewed by the IRB and agreed to or not agreed to by the IRB, same as with the DSMB as well. That doesn't relieve any site of not reporting to their IRB based off their IRB reporting guidelines. And so the relationship between the IRB and the site and the requirements imposed by the IRB to the site may in fact be different than what is required to put in a central database. And those are important distinctions as well, too. But each protocol is reviewed by the IRB. The language is clearly specified within the protocol. And so far, IRBs have been comfortable with and accepting these variations on reporting. And the new FDA guidelines actually talk about developing additional strategies for reporting to make safety reporting more relevant to the risk in the population being studied.
Thank you very much.
There are no other questions or comments in the phone queue at this time. Actually, Amy just re-queued. We'll go back.
It was an accident.
Okay, so I do have another question coming from Paul Hakeem. What happens to all the reported AEs and SAEs? What does NIDA or DSMB typically do with them?
That's a great question. Basically, those are reviewed, and you know, the DSMB members are typically clinicians, and as I'm a clinician as well too. And so when we review reported events, we review them in the context of the patient population and the intervention and the anticipated risk to see if those events reported fit into our assumptions or assessments of those of the risk. If we don't identify a safety signal with that, then the study basically is allowed to continue and continue to enroll. If a safety signal is identified, then further steps are taken through recommendations from the DSMB or from the medical monitor in terms of looking at other types of events, looking at other data, getting more information from the clinical trial to assess that safety signal that may be determined from the reported events. So I think it is reviewed most of the time in these trials. We have not been seeing significant safety signals that have warranted intervention. So in one trial during a tapering phase of agonist therapy, we saw an increase in reported SAEs and suicidal ideation and things like that, and so it created a heightened vigilance during that time period for the clinical trial to take, you know, extra care in terms of assessing participants for potential risk. And so we did implement some interventions within the trial and discussed it within the trial. So sometimes we do see safety signals that will create some change in the trial or how we view the procedures that we do.
Okay, that's all the questions that I have in the queue right now. If anybody has a question, I'd like to remind you to press *1.
There are no questions coming in the phone queue at this time.
Okay, we're coming up at the top of the hour. I'd like to thank everybody for joining. What we have here for you is the polling question review, in case anybody wants to use this PowerPoint presentation. Again, it was intended to be a reference document for you guys as well. What I also like to remind everybody is the session has been recorded and will be available on the CTN Dissemination Library as well as on LiveLink. Thanks everybody for joining. If you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to call me at ctntraining@emmes.com. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
This concludes today's presentation. Thank you for your participation.